So having said that, I'd like to go ahead and demystify a lot of these other menus before we get much further. I'm just going to close the outliner for now. So over here on the left, we have what's called the toolbar. And the toolbar has a lot of the functions that we've already looked at, which is the translate right here, the rotate, and the scale. So again, those are accessible with the hotkeys W, E, and R. And if you look over here, you can see them changing as I hit them on the keyboard. It's much faster for you to use the hotkeys, and I recommend that you go that way. But if you want, you can always use these here. There's also a couple other ones. We've got the select tool, which is actually the Q button on your keyboard. And that just allows you to select things without actually moving them. Now you can also select them with the translate turned on. It's just a matter of hitting it like this. So it's kind of the same thing, but when you're using the select button, there's no chance of you accidentally moving something or rotating something. We also have a lasso selection tool. So it gives you a little lasso icon here, and I can draw a selection around what I want to select. I don't use that very often, but it does exist for you to use. So there's a couple other things here that I'm just going to pass over for now because we haven't quite gotten to that level of use of the program yet. But there's some other tools here. Polygon cube tool, so yeah, we'll get to this stuff. I did want to talk about this though. You noticed how I jumped from the 4 view to the single perspective with the spacebar tapping? Do that again. So I can tap this and then just move to whatever camera I want to look through. You can also do that here. So you've got the single view and then the 4 view. So I'm just clicking with the mouse now. I'm not tapping with the keyboard. There's also another view here called Perspective Outliner. So remember the outliner I had opened just a second ago? Now it's docked into this panel, and you can slide it around like this. So you can make it really big, and now essentially it shares the space with your perspective camera. And this is the configuration I usually work with. If you get tired of looking at this or you don't need it, you can just hit the spacebar and it goes away. Tap it again, and it comes back. There's also a bunch of other layouts that have other menus that we haven't really gotten into yet. Just as an example, this is the hypershade for surfacing. So this is the hypergraph, which is another way of selecting things, but we don't have to worry about this stuff right now. But just so you know, those things exist. But again, this is the default, or at least it's my default that I always use. Okay, so that's the toolbar. This is the outliner. Here's our perspective window. We've already talked about the timeline down here at the bottom. There's my cube moving around. And we also have, let's get back to shaded view here. I'll talk about this in a sec. We also have this down here. It's called the range slider. And what the range slider does is it allows you to change the timeline. So right now I have frames 1 through 24 going from left to right, and that's dictated by this slider here. So if I left mouse button on this little control, I can bring this down, and if you notice, as I'm moving this down and reducing the frames, the number of frames on my timeline are also being reduced, or I can make it much more too. So let's just leave it at 24 for now. These dialogues are for the same thing, so you can specify 24 or 48, what the minimum and maximum are. This little dialogue on the timeline tells you what frame you're on, so we're on frame 7. This is like a little play, fast forward, rewind kind of thing. I don't really use this because I'm a modeler, but somebody who's creating like special particle effects would have to use this because the particle systems are really dependent upon not scrubbing the timeline but actually starting at the beginning. But we don't have to worry about that right now either. So this is called the status line, and what this is, if you notice, if I were to save the scene, we already looked at this before, but it tells you what Maya is doing or what it's thinking about. So whenever a major action is happening, Maya will give you some feedback about what it is right here. This is the mel bar, so if you want, you can type in mel code right here, and we'll touch more on mel code in just a little bit. And then we've got the little help bar down here at the bottom. So if you're ever confused about what something does, if you look down here at the bottom as I move my mouse around, as I'm moving over these things on the toolbar, it's telling me what they are. So it's sort of like little pop-up text. It's just down there at the bottom, so you always know what it is. I usually have that turned off, and we'll talk about turning some of this stuff off too. But to carry on for the moment, that covers the bottom, and up here at the top, these little icons are all found within these menus here. So we'll go through this. We won't go through all of it, but because you don't really need to know much of it yet. But essentially, all these little dialogues are responsible for how you view this scene here. There's many different ways to view it. For example, if you click this button, we're going to look at this in wireframe mode. If you click this button, then you go to shaded mode, which is how we usually work when we're modeling. And then there's also this third one here called wireframe unshaded, which gives you both. So you can see the wireframe and you can see the shaded portion as well. And this is also a way that I work a lot when I'm modeling. But let's leave that right here for now. And these other ones I'm going to skip over because honestly there's so many things that I could talk about in Maya. If I were to go through every single menu and option, you'd be here forever. And I'd never get this finished anyway. So this is what's called a panel. And these are the panel menu options. So up here we have another UI element. This is called the shelf. And on the shelf you've got these tabs. And all these things refer to different commands and things you can do in Maya. Some of which we're going to talk about in later lectures, like the polygons menu. Some of them we're not going to get into, like the animation, dynamics, rendering, paint effects, and all this other stuff. Like I was saying before, Maya is just a mountain of a program. There's so many different things. So the fact that we're focusing just on modeling is a good thing. And even within that discipline, I can only give you, part of the story. So if you want to be successful as a modeler in general, you've got to go above and beyond and surpass what I'm teaching you and learn about all this stuff on your own. But for right now, as a beginner, we don't have to worry about much of this stuff. Okay, and above the shelf, we have something called the status line, which we can talk more about later as well. Yeah, I'm not going to get too much into this, but these are just more commands that you can toggle on and off. But the thing to really remember is that all of the stuff that we've just looked at are pretty much available through here, through these top menus. So these are the main ones we're going to be looking at. Not so much end particles or end mesh. Let's see. So if you look at this menu right here, you can see that we have animation, polygons, surfaces. We're mainly going to be dealing in the polygon menu. So as you can see, it changes as we go through these, and different things appear. But a couple of them stay the same at all times, and those are these 5 or 6 menus. So these are the main menu bars. Like I was mentioning earlier, we've got the hotbox too, though. So you never really need to go up here if you don't want to. It's really just a preference. And quite often I'll be working with the hotbox. So you'll see you've got the File, Edit, Menu, Create, Display, Window, and all those are right here. The reason I would use the hotbox as opposed to these top menus are simply because when you're working in 3D, anything you can do to save time, even just this action that I'm doing right now, is beneficial. So if I can have a menu pop up right where my mouse already is, that's a benefit to me. And it really does sound kind of silly to say that, like it's not that big of a deal, right? Just to move your mouse up here. But you have to consider if you're working on a model and it's taking hours and hours and days of your time and weeks, and over the course of a 3D career, you're talking about years and years. Those little half seconds do add up, and I'm sure I've saved probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 days of work at this point in my career just by not moving my mouse bar or my mouse up and down like that. And that actually leads into a larger discussion about hotkeys, which I'll save for now, but we will talk about before this lecture is over, because having hotkeys and little shortcuts to save you time is such a huge part of working efficiently.